Winter Haven, a sleepy, snow-blanketed town tucked deep in the hills of Vermont, lived for Christmas. Lights twinkled on every street corner, children bundled in woolen scarves built snowmen in their front yards, and the smell of pine and gingerbread drifted through the air. For most, it was a season of joy, but for Ethan Walker, Christmas was a cruel reminder of all he had lost. He used to thrive in the holiday season, capturing the spirit of humanity as an award-winning investigative journalist. Now, he was a shadow of himself, a man reduced to bitter solitude, living in a crumbling cabin on the edge of the woods. The fire in the stone hearth crackled, doing little to chase away the chill that seeped through the cracks of the old cabin. Ethan sat hunched over a stack of unpaid bills, a mug of coffee growing cold beside him. His once steadfast hands now trembled as he scribbled out a futile budget, a cruel side effect of the degenerative disease slowly sapping his strength. He couldn't face the pity of others, so he'd retreated here, away from the world that once hailed him as a hero of truth. The knock came suddenly, a frantic scratching against the wooden door. Ethan froze. No one visited him, especially not in the middle of a snowstorm. He listened for a moment, thinking perhaps it was just the wind. But then it came again, more insistent this time. With a resigned sigh, he pushed himself to his feet, each movement a reminder of his body's betrayal. He shuffled to the door, wrapped in a faded plaid robe. When he pulled it open, the biting wind hit him first, then the sight of the dog. A small figure huddled against the storm, covered in snow, with fur as golden as autumn leaves and eyes as bright as polished amber. Ethan scowled. "What are you doing out here, huh?" he muttered, his breath visible in the cold. The dog looked up at him, its head cocked slightly, as if understanding the question. Ethan hesitated. He wasn't in the business of helping strays, not anymore. Yet there was something about the dog's gaze, unwavering, almost pleading, that tugged at a long-buried sense of compassion. Muttering a curse under his breath, he stepped aside. "Fine, come in, but just for the night." The dog padded inside, shaking snow from its coat, and made a beeline for the fireplace. Ethan shut the door, muttering to himself about bad decisions, before returning to his chair. "Don't get too comfortable," he called over his shoulder, but the dog had already curled into a ball on the worn rug in front of the fire. Ethan watched it warily. The animal was thin but clean, and it wore no collar, just a simple leather strap around its neck with a single silver tag. He leaned closer to inspect it. The tag had no name, just a small engraving. "Charlie." "Well, Charlie," Ethan said, the name unfamiliar on his tongue. "I don't know where you came from, but I hope you're not expecting a warm welcome." The dog didn't respond, of course, but there was something unsettling about the way it stared at him. It wasn't just the warmth of gratitude he saw in those eyes. It was as if Charlie were studying him, assessing him, even judging him. That night, Ethan tried to ignore the dog as he settled into his usual routine. The howling storm outside rattled the cabin, but Charlie seemed unbothered, resting peacefully by the fire. For a while, Ethan stared at his old typewriter gathering dust on the desk. Once, it had been his weapon of choice, unearthing secrets and challenging corruption. Now, it was just a relic of a life he no longer believed in. As the hours passed, Ethan found himself speaking aloud to Charlie, as if the dog could understand him. He talked about the storm, the isolation, even his frustration with the holiday season. It was strange, the way the words came so easily. He hadn't spoken this much in months, maybe years. Charlie simply watched him, head tilted slightly, as if absorbing every word. When Ethan finally went to bed, he left the dog by the fire, unsure if it would still be there come morning. He figured Charlie would move on, back into the storm, or perhaps to another unsuspecting soul willing to offer a meal and warmth. But when he woke the next day, the dog was there, sitting at the foot of his bed. Ethan startled at first, then sighed. "Guess you've decided to stay, huh?" He sat up, rubbing his aching joints. "I don't have much to offer, you know." Charlie wagged his tail, a slow and deliberate motion that seemed more like a statement than excitement. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that this dog wasn't ordinary. Something about him was purposeful. Later that day, As Ethan brewed coffee and debated whether to head into town for supplies, Charlie grew restless. The dog began pawing at the door, whining softly. "What now?" Ethan grumbled, but when he opened the door, Charlie bolted outside, barking for the first time. Ethan hurried after him, pulling on his coat and boots. The dog led him to the edge of the woods, where the snow was thick and untouched. There, partially buried in the drift, was something Ethan hadn't expected: a weathered leather glove. He picked it up, his breath catching in his throat when he saw the initials embroidered on the cuff. Yes, Ethan staggered back, clutching the glove. The initials were unmistakable. They belonged to Emily Sanders, the young woman whose disappearance had haunted this town and ruined his career. Charlie barked again, urging him forward, but Ethan's legs felt like lead. He stared down at the glove, memories of the case rushing back like the wind that bit at his face. "Why are you showing me this?" he whispered, looking at the dog. Charlie stood still, his golden fur glowing against the snow, his amber eyes locked on Ethan's. For the first time in years, Ethan felt a flicker of something he thought he'd lost forever: purpose. Ethan hadn't thought about Emily Sanders in years, not willingly at least. The case was a scar he carried, one that stung with the chill of regret. She had been only 22, a bright-eyed college student with a love for photography, when she vanished one snowy night 5 years ago. Ethan's reporting on her disappearance had pointed fingers at Winter Haven's elite, claiming a cover-up, but he lacked the evidence to back it up. The fallout had been brutal. Lawsuits, public ridicule, and the collapse of his career followed in quick succession. And now, here he was, holding her glove as if time had never moved forward. Charlie barked again, snapping Ethan out of his thoughts. The dog stood a few paces ahead, tail stiff, ears alert, as though urging Ethan to follow. "What do you want me to do with this?" Ethan muttered, staring at the glove. But Charlie gave no answer, only a determined bark before bounding deeper into the woods. Ethan hesitated, glancing back at his cabin. His instincts told him to let it go, to toss the glove aside and retreat into his safe, miserable solitude. But curiosity, or perhaps a flicker of something greater, pushed him forward. The path Charlie led him on was treacherous, winding through snow-covered trees and over patches of ice. Ethan's legs ached, his breath came in short gasps, and his joints screamed in protest. "This better be worth it," he grumbled, though he wasn't entirely sure who he was speaking to, Charlie or himself. Finally, they reached a clearing where the dog stopped abruptly, his nose to the ground. Ethan followed his gaze and spotted something partially buried under a drift of snow: a small leather satchel. Kneeling, Ethan dug the bag out with trembling hands. The leather was cracked with age, but the clasp opened easily. Inside, he found a camera, its surface scratched and weathered. His chest tightened as he turned it over, seeing Emily's name etched faintly along the strap. He pressed the power button, though he already knew it wouldn't work. The camera was dead, its battery long drained. "Emily's camera," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. Holding it felt surreal, like stepping back into the story that had defined and destroyed him. This was a piece of her, tangible and real, yet it offered no answers. Why had Charlie brought him here? And why now, after all this time? Back at the cabin, Ethan cleaned the camera carefully, laying its contents out on the table. Inside the satchel, he found a few memory cards and a notebook, its pages damp but still legible. Flipping through it, he saw sketches and notes in Emily's handwriting. She had detailed the people she planned to interview for a photo series: local leaders, business owners, and even members of the town council. Ethan's stomach churned as he recognized several names from his own investigation. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. He froze. Nobody visited him, especially unannounced. Glancing at Charlie, who was unusually tense, Ethan moved cautiously toward the door and opened it just a crack. A woman stood there, bundled against the cold, her face partially obscured by a scarf. "Mr. Walker?" she asked, her voice tinged with hesitation. "Who's asking?" Ethan replied, his tone sharp. "My name is Sarah Collins. I'm a journalist. Well, trying to be one," she added quickly. I've been looking into the Emily Sanders case, and I heard you might be able to help. Ethan stiffened, gripping the edge of the door. You've got the wrong man, he said flatly, beginning to close it. Wait. Sarah stepped forward, her hand on the door. I know what happened to you. The lawsuits, the blacklisting. But I think you were onto something, and I think Emily knew it too. Ethan hesitated, his mind racing. What was this woman after? Was she another vulture looking for a sensationalized story? But something in her eyes reminded him of himself, of the determination he once had. With a reluctant sigh, he opened the door wider and gestured for her to come in. Over steaming mugs of coffee, Sarah explained her findings. I've been digging into the town's financial records, she said, spreading a series of photocopied documents across the table. There's a lot of money that's unaccounted for, funds from the community redevelopment project that vanished without a trace. Emily was working on a story about it before she disappeared. Ethan studied the papers, his mind churning. He had followed a similar trail years ago but had hit dead ends at every turn. Now, with Emily's notebook and camera, pieces of the puzzle seemed to be falling into place. He shared what he'd found in the satchel, including the names in Emily's notes. Together, they began to connect the dots, uncovering a pattern of corruption that pointed to some of the most powerful figures in Winter Haven. But as the picture became clearer, so did the danger. Ethan noticed a black SUV parked near the tree line outside his cabin, a vehicle that didn't belong to any of his reclusive neighbors. His paranoia flared. You brought attention with you, he said to Sarah, his tone accusatory. Sarah looked out the window, her face pale. I didn't think, she began, but Ethan cut her off. You didn't think, period, he snapped. If they know we're onto something, they won't hesitate to shut us down. Permanently, Charlie barked, drawing their attention. The dog stood at the door, his tail rigid and ears pricked. Ethan's pulse quickened. He had no proof, but he trusted Charlie's instincts more than his own. We need to move, he said, grabbing the satchel and shoving the papers back into it. Sarah looked panicked. Move? Where? Anywhere but here, Ethan growled, pulling on his coat. He grabbed a flashlight and his old, battered typewriter, a symbol of the life he was about to reclaim. If we're going to finish what Emily started, we need to stay one step ahead of them. As they slipped out the back door, the snow began to fall again, heavy and relentless. Charlie led the way, his golden fur a beacon against the white expanse. Ethan followed, clutching the satchel like a lifeline, his mind racing with possibilities and dangers. For the first time in years, he felt alive, not just surviving, but truly living with purpose. And though the path ahead was uncertain, he knew one thing for sure. The truth was out there, waiting to be found. The snowstorm clung to Winter Haven like a shroud, blanketing the town in eerie silence. Ethan's breath came in sharp bursts as he trudged through the woods, Charlie leading the way with purposeful strides. Sarah followed close behind, her face pale and eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. The weight of Emily Sanders' satchel hung heavily on Ethan's shoulder, its contents a fragile link between the past and the storm of corruption they were about to unearth. Where are we going? Sarah's voice cut through the steady crunch of snow underfoot. Ethan glanced back at her, his expression grim. There's an old church at the edge of town. It hasn't been used in decades, but it's where I used to meet a source who helped me with Emily's case. If anyone still has answers, it'll be there. Charlie barked softly, as if in agreement, and pressed forward, his golden fur glowing faintly in the dim light of Ethan's flashlight. The dog's uncanny sense of direction and timing continued to unsettle Ethan, though he had long stopped questioning it. Charlie wasn't just a dog. He was something more. What exactly, Ethan couldn't say, but for now, he was grateful for the guidance. The trek through the woods was grueling. Branches, heavy with snow, sagged low, and icy winds bit at exposed skin. Ethan's legs burned with exertion, and his joints screamed in protest, but he pushed through the pain. He couldn't afford to stop. Not now. Finally, they emerged from the trees to find the church looming ahead. The structure was a skeleton of its former self. Its roof partially caved in, stained glass windows shattered, and ivy creeping up the stone walls. It stood like a sentinel, silent and foreboding, holding secrets that had been buried for too long. Ethan led them through a side entrance, the door creaking ominously as he pushed it open. Inside, the air was frigid, and the faint smell of decay lingered. Dust motes floated in the beam of his flashlight, illuminating rows of broken pews and an altar draped in cobwebs. "Stay close," he muttered to Sarah, though she was already clinging to his side. Charlie trotted ahead, his paws silent on the cracked tile floor. He stopped near the altar, sniffing intently before letting out a low growl. Ethan's pulse quickened. "What is it, boy?" Kneeling beside the dog, Ethan swept the beam of his flashlight over the area. His heart sank when it landed on a hidden compartment in the floor, its edges barely visible under a layer of dirt and debris. He cleared it with trembling hands and pried it open to reveal a small metal box. Inside the box were photographs, dozens of them, each one a snapshot of Emily Sanders' final days. She was smiling in some, her camera slung over her shoulder, but others were more haunting. Her face pale with fear, a shadowy figure looming in the background. Ethan's throat tightened as he flipped through them, his anger and guilt bubbling to the surface. "Whoever took these wanted her to be afraid," he said through gritted teeth. "They wanted to control her." Sarah peered over his shoulder, her eyes wide. "Look at the background," she whispered, pointing to a series of photos taken near a construction site. "That's the redevelopment project, the one with the missing funds." Ethan's mind raced. The project had been a cornerstone of Winter Haven's supposed revival, but it had always been mired in controversy. Now, it was clear that Emily had uncovered something far more sinister, something that had cost her life. A sudden noise broke the silence, a muffled crunch of snow just outside the church. Ethan froze, his flashlight snapping off as he motioned for Sarah to stay quiet. Charlie's ears perked, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate, they grew louder as they approached the entrance. Ethan's pulse pounded in his ears. "They found us," he mouthed to Sarah, his breath visible in the frigid air. He grabbed the metal box and gestured for her to follow him deeper into the church. They slipped into the shadows, crouching behind a row of pews. The door creaked open, and the beam of a flashlight swept across the room. Ethan held his breath as two figures stepped inside, their faces obscured by scarves and hats. One of them carried a pistol. "We know you're here, Walker," one of them called out, his voice cold and mocking. "You should have stayed buried with your career." Ethan clenched his fists, his mind racing. He had no weapon, no plan, and no way to fight them off. But Charlie had other ideas. The dog bolted from their hiding spot, a blur of golden fur, and lunged at the armed man with a ferocity Ethan hadn't seen before. The man stumbled back, firing a shot that echoed through the church, but it went wide, shattering what remained of a stained glass window. "Go," Ethan hissed at Sarah, dragging her toward a side exit while the men were distracted. They burst into the cold night, the metal box clutched tightly in Ethan's hands. Behind them, Charlie barked furiously, buying them precious seconds to escape. They didn't stop running until they reached the edge of the woods, their breaths ragged and visible in the icy air. Ethan collapsed against a tree, his body screaming for rest. "Charlie," he panted, scanning the darkness. "Where's Charlie?" As if on cue, the dog emerged from the shadows, his fur matted with snow but otherwise unharmed. He trotted up to Ethan and nudged his hand with his nose. Relief washed over him, and he gave the dog a shaky pat. "Good boy," he whispered. "You're one hell of a guardian angel." Sarah crouched beside him, her face pale but resolute. "What now?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Ethan looked down at the box in his lap, its contents damning and dangerous. "We take this to the police," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. He knew the men in power would bury the evidence before it ever saw the light of day. "No," Sarah said, shaking her head. "We go public. You're the only one who can tell this story, who can finish what Emily started." Ethan hesitated, the weight of her words sinking in. His career had been destroyed by this town, and his health was failing by the day. But as he looked at Charlie, who had risked everything to protect him, and at Sarah, who still believed in the power of truth, he realized he had no choice. "All right," he said finally, his voice firm. "We exposed them. Every last one of them." Charlie wagged his tail, his amber eyes gleaming with something that looked almost like approval. Together, they disappeared into the woods, leaving the ruins of the church and the ghosts of the past behind them. The sun was barely a suggestion on the horizon when Ethan, Sarah, and Charlie emerged from the woods into the quiet streets of Winter Haven. The town was cloaked in an uneasy stillness, its festive decorations at odds with the tension humming in the air. Ethan clutched the metal box tightly, its damning contents a weight both literal and symbolic. This was it, the moment that would either vindicate him or destroy him for good. Sarah walked beside him, her laptop bag slung over her shoulder, ready to upload the evidence. She had already called a local radio station and arranged for an anonymous whistleblower to release the story. The plan was risky, but they couldn't trust the authorities. Not when so many were complicit in the web of corruption that had claimed Emily Sanders' life. Charlie trotted ahead, his tail wagging slightly as if sensing their determination. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the dog understood far more than he should. "You ready for this, boy?" he murmured. Charlie turned his head briefly, his amber eyes meeting Ethan's in a way that felt almost human. It was enough to steady Ethan's nerves. They took refuge in a small diner on the edge of town, its neon sign flickering in the dim morning light. Inside, the waitress gave them a curious glance but said nothing as they slid into a booth at the back. Sarah immediately set up her laptop, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she prepared the files for upload. Ethan spread out the photos and documents on the table, their damning clarity a stark reminder of what they were up against. The names and faces in Emily's notebook painted a grim picture. Politicians, businessmen, even the chief of police. They had all been involved in the fraudulent redevelopment project, funneling money into offshore accounts while silencing anyone who got too close to the truth. "She knew everything," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion as she scrolled through Emily's notes. "And they killed her for it." Ethan nodded, his jaw tight. "Not just her. They destroyed anyone who dared to ask questions, including me." He paused, his gaze dropping to Charlie, who sat patiently at his feet. But not this time. As the files began uploading, the bell above the diner's door jingled. Ethan tensed instinctively, his hand drifting toward the satchel. A man in a long coat stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room before landing on their booth. Ethan recognized him instantly, Tom Harlow, one of the town councilmen he had accused years ago. Harlow's lips curled into a thin, wolfish smile as he approached. "Walker," Harlow said smoothly, sliding into the booth across from them without invitation. "You've been busy." Ethan's grip on the satchel tightened. "I could say the same about you," Harlow chuckled, his tone oozing false camaraderie. "Come on, Ethan. Let's not pretend this is anything more than a desperate attempt to relive your glory days. You don't want to drag this town through the mud again, do you? Haven't you caused enough damage?" "You did that all on your own," Ethan shot back. "And now the whole world is going to see it." Harlow's smile faltered, replaced by a hard, cold glare. "You think uploading some files is going to bring us down? We've covered our tracks, Walker. No one will believe you." "They'll believe the photos," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear flickering in her eyes. "And the financial records. And the testimonies." Harlow's gaze shifted to her, his expression predatory. "And who are you? Another naive idealist? Let me give you some advice, sweetheart. Walk away. This isn't your fight." Charlie growled low, a deep, guttural sound that sent a chill through the booth. Harlow glanced down at the dog, his bravado wavering. Ethan took the opportunity to lean in, his voice cold as steel. "You don't scare me, Harlow. Not anymore. And you won't scare her either." Before Harlow could respond, the laptop pinged. Sarah looked down, her eyes lighting up. "The files are live," she said. "They're already being shared." For a moment, the booth was silent. Then Harlow stood, his face twisted with fury. "You think you've won?" he hissed. "This town is mine, Walker. You've just signed your death warrant." He stormed out, slamming the door behind him. Ethan exhaled slowly, his hands trembling slightly. "That went well," he muttered dryly. But their victory was short-lived. Minutes later, the power in the diner flickered and died, plunging the room into dim emergency lighting. Outside, the sound of engines roared to life. Ethan peered through the window and saw two black SUVs pulling into the lot, their headlights cutting through the snow. "They're coming," Sarah whispered, panic creeping into her voice. Ethan grabbed the satchel and stood, his movements swift despite the pain in his joints. "We need to move. Now." They slipped out the back, the cold air biting at their faces as they ran into the alley behind the diner. Charlie led the way, his instincts as sharp as ever. The sound of boots crunching on snow echoed behind them, growing louder with each passing second. They reached the edge of the woods just as the first shot rang out. Sarah screamed, and Ethan grabbed her arm, pulling her down behind a snowbank. "Stay low," he barked, his breath visible in the icy air. Charlie barked furiously, darting between them and the men pursuing them. Ethan's heart clenched as he watched the dog, his golden fur standing out against the white snow. "Charlie, no!" he shouted, but the dog wouldn't retreat. The men closed in, their flashlights bobbing through the trees. Ethan knew they couldn't outrun them. Not like this. Gritting his teeth, he made a decision. "Sarah, take the files and go," he said, thrusting the satchel into her hands. "Find the radio station. Tell them everything." "What about you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'll hold them off," he said, his voice firm. "Charlie and I will buy you time." Tears filled Sarah's eyes, but she nodded, clutching the satchel tightly. "Be careful," she whispered before disappearing into the woods. Ethan turned back to face their pursuers, his heart pounding. Charlie stood at his side, his growl low and steady. Together, they would face whatever came next. As the men approached, Ethan felt a surge of defiance. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for Emily, for Sarah, and for the truth. The first man rounded the corner, his gun raised. Ethan shouted, drawing his attention, and Charlie lunged, his teeth sinking into the man's arm. Chaos erupted, but Ethan didn't flinch. For the first time in years, he wasn't afraid. Thank you very much for watching the video to the end. If you were moved by the story of the canine hero and the spirit of Christmas that transformed lives, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments what you thought of this exciting journey.